Teeth by Matt Cardin. Read by Jon Padgett. And he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. Ecclesiastes 1:18. Consciousness is a disease. Miguel de Unamuno. 1. My first and decisive glimpse into the horror at the center of existence came unexpectedly during my second year of graduate school. I was earning a doctorate in philosophy and had stopped by the library between classes for some extracurricular research, or rather to pursue what I had long considered to be my true curriculum, regardless of whatever official degree program I might be enrolled in at the time. The object of my quest was a copy of Plotinus's Aeneads. I had only heard of the man and his house an hour earlier while browsing the internet in my rented house. A fortuitous combination of search terms had yielded an excerpt from his treatise on beauty, and I had experienced a flashing moment of metaphysical vertigo as I read his description of the spirit that beauty must ever induce, wonderment and a delicious trouble, longing and love and a trembling that is all delight. These words and their effect upon me had made it instantly clear that a printed copy of this book was definitely in order. So there I was, winding my way silently through the second-floor stacks and savoring the library's familiar aura of wondrous knowledge, awaiting my discovery of it in hushed anticipation. But instead of finding Plotinus's book, I instead turned a corner and stumbled upon my friend Marco, seated at a reading kiosk in the middle of the south wall. The tall window above him spilled a shaft of dusty afternoon sunlight into the burnished tile floor, imparting a muted glow to the kiosk and its occupant. "Marco," I said with genuine pleasure. "Hello, Jason," he murmured, and went right on reading and writing without glancing up from his books. He was surrounded by piles of them, all impressive tomes of various sizes and ages and thicknesses, so numerous they were literally spilling off the table. 3 were propped open on the desktop, and he appeared to be copying passages from all of them into a lined notebook. When he did not pause in his work, I lapsed back into an uncertain silence. Marco was a visiting student from Guatemala with an exquisite command of English and an accent so slight that it left some listeners unable to discern his origin. His auburn skin, coal-black hair, and muscular physique gave him the air of a revolutionary from some third-world country. He was, without a doubt, the most brilliant and widely read person I had ever met, a genuine savant who was simultaneously pursuing separate graduate degrees in physics, philosophy, and history. We had met at the beginning of the fall semester, and I had quickly learned that his chic terrorist look concealed a fierce intelligence. Now, at the end of the spring term, I was still amazed at his vast capabilities. He could discourse at length on almost any subject, displaying a verbal and intellectual virtuosity that put others to shame. Adding to his mystique was the fact that he was only 26 years old. I found it impossible to reconcile his relatively young age with his positively fearsome erudition. The books arrayed on the desktop before him were a perfect example. I scanned their titles and found them to be of sufficiently diverse and advanced character to dizzy the average mind. It was as I stood there watching and waiting in vain for our ongoing intellectual sparring match to resume that I felt the first prickling of unease. Our interactions had always centered on a perennial philosophical conversation that never failed to exhilarate me, even as it exhausted and humbled me. But on that day, in my beloved university library, with me standing there primed for a dialogue and brimful of a craving for Neoplatonic expressions of transcendent beauty, Marco apparently had nothing to say to me. I used the uncomfortable interlude to study his appearance more closely. His mouth and jaw were tight. His eyes appeared slightly sunken into dark sockets. His shoulders were tense, his motions taut and meticulous as he continued his scribal work. He fairly exuded an air of intensity, mingled with exhaustion. The word haunted sprang involuntarily to my mind as an appropriate one-word description. Then he said, "How are your classes?" Only his mouth moved. The rest of him maintained an unbroken focus on his work. Some good, some not. I groped for a suitable entry point into this strange conversational exigency. Teaching philosophy to disinterested freshmen is a bit like asking your cat to come to you. They really don't give a shit. I winced at my own ridiculous words, but somehow they were enough to reach him. He paused in his writing, pen lifted above page, and appeared to reflect. Ah, yes, philosophy. We do love it, you and I. How was it that Will Durant once defined it? Total perspective, mind overspreading life and forging chaos into unity. His tone implied something like a rueful smile, but as I watched him speak the words, his face remained fixed in that expression of hollow intensity. At length, he set his pen down and straightened from the hunched posture he had been holding. "Do you have a few minutes before your next class?" I was still fumbling to pick up the obscure thread of this weirdly stilted interaction. Sure, a few. What's up?" He hesitated, then said, "I want to show you something that I'm confident you will find quite interesting, perhaps even fascinating given what I know of your intellectual proclivities." "How utterly mysterious," I said, attempting with a resounding thunderclap of failure to add a little levity to the scene. Marco showed no reaction other than to close and stack his books neatly, one by one, on the desktop to await collection by a library aide. Then he slid his notebook into his ever-present satchel and stood up. Without even looking at me, he headed for the stairs, and without my even hesitating, I fell in tow and forgot all about Plotinus and his promise to employ mere words to describe the impossible, delightful, delicious apotheosis of beauty itself. 2. We stood facing each other in Marco's cramped dorm room, walled in by bland cinder blocks and beige paint. Marco held out a spiral notebook toward me. I looked at him curiously and, in light of our meeting's odd beginning, a bit cautiously. "Take it," he said. "Look on the 46th page." I took the notebook and examined it while my mind whispered the word anticlimax. This was nothing special, just an ordinary 72-page, college-ruled spiral notebook with a red cover. It was, in fact, the same notebook that Marco had been writing in earlier at the library, and I couldn't help feeling a flash of irritation at what now seemed his rather theatrical refusal to show it to me in public. But there was no use complaining now. I perched on the edge of one of the room's twin beds and flipped open the notebook's cover to find the first page crammed with Marco's small and scrupulous handwriting. My eyes began scanning the text while my brain registered that the notebook appeared to be a combination of commonplace book and personal journal filled with Marco's thoughts on quantum physics, history, philosophy, and a few other subjects I could not immediately identify. Instantly, my curiosity kicked in at the thought that I was being allowed a glimpse into my friend's private mind. I began to flip slowly through the notebook in search of page 46, which was made easy by the fact that Marco had hand-numbered the pages in the upper right corner. Naturally, I stole as many glimpses as I could of the material on the intervening pages, and what I saw quickly sharpened my curiosity into a craving. Although the notebook's primary subject was not readily apparent, I discerned that Marco was conducting a serious inquiry into a certain matter, an inquiry that encompassed ideas from fantastically diverse fields of knowledge. He made great use of quotations from other writers, and I caught snatches of a theoretical treatise on quantum physics by Niels Bohr, a monograph by an obscure astronomer, a book of Hermetic occultism, the Hindu philosopher Sankara's commentary on the Vedanta Sutras, and writings of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. These last three were familiar to me. As a student of philosophy, I had encountered them more than once in my own studies. The net effect of seeing all of these quotes together was to generate a sense that the comforting constellation of my familiar authors, books, and philosophies opened out into a vastly wider universe of unknown properties. I lingered for a moment on page 45 to examine the two quotes that appeared there. One came from a book with a strange name that was vaguely reminiscent of Hindu deities. The other was from a story by H.P. Lovecraft. I had heard of the latter, but the former was completely unfamiliar to me. My curiosity finally got the better of me, and I blurted out, "What is all this? What in the world are you getting at?" "It will help," Marco said, "if you will turn to the next page." The tightness of his voice drew my eyes away from the notebook and up to his face. He sat opposite me on the other bed, mirroring my posture of perched attentiveness. His hands gripped the edge of the mattress. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. The expression in his dark, ringed eyes was unreadable. I stared at him for a long moment before finally looking back down and turning the page. Of all the things I might or might not have expected to find, an elaborate sacred drawing was surely among the last. And yet that was exactly what I found. Rendered in the same blue ink that Marco had used to record his thoughts and quotes was an incredibly intricate visual pattern composed of abstract shapes, shadings, and forms. Its design was dense and complex, but what made it truly striking was its lushness and vividness, which made it seem three-dimensional. At the same time, it was reminiscent of a Zen painting with its distinct dependence on space and absence to contextualize and comment on form and presence. Most amazingly, its elements were arranged according to some alternative philosophy of design that flouted and exploded common artistic principles of harmony, emphasis, opposition, and so on. Each line led the eye to one or more angles that refracted attention like a prism dividing light. Each shape held its position and significance in relation to 100 different elements, each of which was in turn embedded in its own peculiar nest of visual meanings and unstated implications. The overall effect was of a bold, bristling infinity. In a word, I was dazzled. I knew the creation of mandalas to serve as objects of sacred contemplation had been developed into an exquisite art form in religious traditions both Eastern and Western, but the one I was seeing now was even more breathtaking than the ones I had encountered in my studies of Buddhism, Hinduism, and medieval Christianity. I had not known that in addition to his other prodigious gifts, Marco was an artist of genius, but there was no mistaking it. The mandala had been rendered by his pen in his notebook. I went to raise my head so that I could rave to him about the wonderfulness of the drawing and my awe at his secret talent. But then, with a sudden startling sense of the impossible, I found that I could not do it. My neck was locked in place and my eyes were magnetized to the center of the picture. I blinked, or rather tried to, and found that I was likewise prevented from doing that. I was still aware of the room, still aware of the floor and bed beneath me and the walls around me, and of Marco seated across from me, but I could only attend to them with my peripheral vision. It was as if an invisible anchor had been hurled out from the page and lodged in my eyeballs, fastening them to the image and throwing me into an increasingly panicked stage of immobility. I simply could not look away from the mandala, which filled my vision and began to horrify me with what I now perceived as its obscene infinitude. And then it started moving. Right before my disbelieving eyes, the shapes began to stir on the page with a creeping motion like the slow boiling of liquids in an alchemist's laboratory. Every hidden implication and many universe of meaning in the individual elements took on countless additional connotations as the whole shuddered to life. The picture's three-dimensional appearance became literal as the page's center dropped away into a recess of infinite depth. I no longer sat in a room beholding a picture. The picture had become the whole of my consciousness, and it encompassed me, and I stared through it into a chasm of measureless meaning whose very vastness was a horror. Then, in an instant, all motion stopped. A dark spot, no bigger than a pinhead, formed at the mandala's center and began to grow, as if approaching from an impossible distance. Ringed layers of shape and form fell away as this darkness accelerated its all-consuming approach. It resolved and clarified, and now wicked barbs and slivers were visible in its fabric, needled in endless rows of concentric rings like ivory spikes planted in rotten flesh. They churned and fluttered and twitched with a spasmodic motion, and in the tiny corner of my mind that I could still claim as my own, I realized I was staring into a nightmare abyss of endless teeth. A fanged and insatiable cosmic gullet that endlessly devoured all things in an eternal feast of annihilation. All had been a prelude to this. My whole life, my very conception and progress through the stages of human existence had been preordained to lead me to this dreadful moment. I felt the attention of a massive and malevolent intelligence turn upon me, and as I began to pitch forward into the pit, and as the first of trillions of teeth began to sink into my mind, I knew with absolute horrified certainty that this nightmare abyss was also staring into me. 3. A buzzing blackness, darker than darkness, corrosive and cold. That was everything. Then it was as if a light switched on, and that light was the visual image of Marco's dorm room and of Marco himself. He was standing on the ceiling. Either that or the entire room had turned upside down. I watched his inverted image approach a similarly inverted medicine cabinet mounted on the wall. The slick mirrored surface flashed and waved as he opened and shut it. He approached me, still inverted, holding something out to me with his hand. I realized I was lying on my back on one of his beds, arched up and watching him backwards over the edge of the mattress. He stepped beside me, and the room righted itself as my head swiveled to watch him. I tried to say, "What?" but my lungs were paralyzed. I was suffocating. There was a momentary panic. Then my chest let go, and I was sucking huge lungfuls of air. "Take these," Marco said over the sound of my frantic gasps. 2 tiny white pills rested in his outstretched palm. With the other hand, he offered a bottle of water. Somehow, my arms moved. I accepted the pills and washed them down while he slid back to sit at the room's single study desk. "Those were muscle relaxers," he said. "You'll feel more composed in a moment." To my astonishment, he was right. I could already feel the unbearable horror, the impossible horror, draining out of my mind and body, not completely, but enough to let me live. After a minute or two, I sat up and swung my legs off the bed. The feeling of my feet hitting the floor, the sensory solidity beneath the soles of my shoes, revived me even more. I looked at Marco. He had been watching me, but now he looked away and stared at the wall. Finally, he spoke. "If the purpose of philosophy really is to overspread raw life with mind, to gain a truly totalizing perspective that forges unity from chaos, then how do you spread your mind over what just happened to you? How do you include that in your tidy little philosophical cosmos?" Was he really talking this calmly? Was he really acting as if things were normal and we were back to our old conversation, when in fact nothing could ever be normal again after what I just experienced? But I could see the sweat standing out on his forehead and upper lip. He turned his gaze upon me as if awaiting my answer, and for an instant his eyes were like black holes carved in a flesh mask. The floor beneath my feet shifted ever so slightly. Then he was Marco again, but he was still saying things I did not want to hear. "The classic philosophical project has always been held up as a good thing, a noble enterprise that will bring justice and order to people's lives. But what if the very attempt to gain that total perspective is tragically misguided? He shifted in his wooden chair and leaned forward in the pose I had seen him adopt many times before when he was demolishing an opponent. What if life and sanity depend not on finding the truth, but on deliberately cultivating delusion? What if there is indeed a total perspective, but to gain and know it and identify with it is to invite your own deepest disaster? He was still Marco, but he was also something else. Something more, leaning forward and splitting the air between us with the intensity of his words and vision. What if reality itself is finally, fundamentally evil? The words hung there, and then I answered them. What you're saying isn't new, and you know it. The idea of something like it goes at least back to the ancient Greeks, and probably further. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche gave it a classic treatment a little over a century ago. My composure shocked me. The room in my body seemed muffled and distant. Marco straightened and slashed his hand through the air in a gesture of dismissal. You're talking history and theory. I'm talking about reality. Pure, raw, existential. You can't distance yourself from it or gain a handle on it by recalling who first thought of it or what they said about it. For proof, I refer you to your own recent experience, which you're only handling so well because I drugged you. And indeed, he was right. My calmness wasn't my own, and when I tried to see behind it, I saw a raging swarm of terror and revulsion just waiting to arise. It was this subdued awfulness that now began to respond to the idea Marco was advancing, and my drug-induced surface calm suddenly seemed a positive curse, for it left me open to a nasty interplay of unwantedly dark thoughts and associations. My usual self-absorption, my narcissism, my obliviousness to my surroundings as I indulged a constant interior monologue, all these defenses had been stunned, and in the unfamiliar calm of interior silence I heard the sound of something terrible approaching. Marco waited a beat, as if deliberately letting this chaos rage inside me. Then he picked his notebook up from the desk and tossed it into the bed. Read it, he said. It will answer many of your questions. I assume I don't need to tell you to avoid looking at a certain page. I looked at the red cover lying on the brown bedspread and felt the first real intimations of the inner upheaval that would certainly topple me once the drug had completely worn off. The entire situation had to be a dream. It could not be real, because if it were, I could not even articulate the implication. And then there was that drawing, that awesome, beautiful, horrific mandala. What had happened to me as I studied it? Flashes of unreality began to invade the edges of my vision. At the mere remembrance of that mad motion, that impossible infinitude, that galactic tunnel of teeth. What is it? My voice was small and weak, but Marco knew what I was referring to, both the drawing and the reality it revealed. The very question, he replied, approximates the only suitable answer. But you drew that picture yourself. How? My strength to pursue the question gave out as he stood and began ushering me toward the door. Read the notebook, he said. We can talk afterward. Right now, you need to go home and get some rest. I helplessly obeyed. Before I really knew what I was doing, I had left his room and was riding the elevator down to the ground floor. Then I was walking out of the dormitory and across campus to my house. Then I was unlocking the door and stepping inside. The click of the latch as the door swung shut awoke me from my walking trance, and I saw that my hand was gripping Marco's notebook. I dropped it like a hot coal. It slapped to the floor like a snake. I left it there and walked to the bedroom, where I collapsed on the bed and fell immediately asleep. All night I wrestled with a dream that returned repeatedly and never resolved itself. Marco was standing outside my door talking with strangers. I heard their voices rumbling in response to his, but their words were indecipherable and their tones ominous. Then hands began to knock, not just one, but many, rapping smartly on the door and progressing toward a thunderous pounding. The door shuddered in its frame. The knocks were somehow amiss, as if they were produced by the wrong kinds of hands beating on the wrong kind of wood. To my deep dismay, I heard my voice invite Marco and his acquaintances inside. The very invitation unlocked the door, which began to swing inward, and even before it completed its arc and revealed the visitors, I knew full well what I would see. I knew it. The visual confirmation would just be the culmination of a fear that had accompanied me from birth. That was where the dream stopped, only to start again after an interlude of unconsciousness. By the time morning arrived and I awoke to the unbuffered emotions of the previous day's catastrophe, I had seen that door and known that dread 6 times. But that certain knowledge of the visitor's appearance, so inescapable in the dream, had not followed me into the daylight. All I recalled was the door itself, and the sound of rumbling voices, and the knowledge that I had invited my own deepest doom to come inside and make itself at home. 4. The next week of my life was devoted to reading Marco's notebook. Everything else went into hibernation, intellectually and emotionally speaking. Even though I went through the motions of my daily routine, I performed my duties without spirit. All of my energy and attention was directed toward a single and singular purpose: to read and grasp the meaning of the dark philosophical testament that Marco had penned. Grappling with it was the most grueling experience I had ever endured. This was due partly to the fact that Marco's speculations on astronomy and physics were practically incomprehensible to me. But there was another reason as well. A new sense or faculty seemed to have awakened within me, a kind of third eye that remained perpetually open and proved distressingly responsive to the dark suggestions unfolding on the pages before me. As I read the notebook and began to perceive the galling weight of the world view under which Marco labored, I found that the same mingled mind state of disgust and despair being nourished by the reading, which in a loathsome symbiosis was rendered all the more clear and emotionally compelling by this new inner sense. As I had already seen, much of the notebook consisted of long quotations, carefully transcribed by Marco from a wide array of books. Schopenhauer loomed large, as did Nietzsche. It was during my undergraduate years that I had first encountered these giants of German philosophy. Back then, I had exulted in the universal pessimism of the former and its extension and exhilarating transformation by the latter into an exploration of the meaning of human subjecthood. But now I felt as if I were truly understanding them for the first time. Recorded here was Schopenhauer's famous criticism of the assertion so common among some thinkers that evil is merely the absence of good. "I know of no greater absurdity," he wrote, "than that propounded by most systems of philosophy in declaring evil to be negative in its existence. Evil is just what is positive. It makes its own existence felt." The concept was not new to me, but its import, as perceived and amplified by my new inner faculty, hit me like a blow to the head. Also recorded was Nietzsche's amplification of his mentor's idea. "Nobody is very likely to consider a doctrine true merely because it makes people happy or virtuous. Happiness and virtue are no arguments, but people like to forget, even sober spirits, that making unhappy and evil are no counter-arguments. Something might be true while being harmful and dangerous in the highest degree. Indeed, it might be a basic characteristic of existence that those who would know it fully would perish, in which case the strength of a spirit should be measured by how much of the truth one could still barely endure, or to put it more clearly, to what degree one would require it to be thinned down, shrouded, sweetened, blunted, falsified." The quotes spooled on and on, piling up page after page, interspersed occasionally with Marco's own notes and observations. After the Nietzsche quote, for instance, The blue-inked letters of Marco's voice clarified, and so the perfect lie would be the perfect sanctuary, the ultimate one-pointed perspective, and thus the ultimate weakness, while perfect strength would see reality cold, without blinking, and vast without center, and naked without a hint of cognitive or affective coloration. After 2 days of reading, I began to despair of penetrating the notebook's secrets. On the surface, it seemed to be nothing but a particularly pessimistic collection of aphorisms and observations, albeit ones whose significance I was feeling with a weight and an impact that were veritably physical. And still the searing memory of that picture on page 46 jutted out like a broken bone in the skeleton of my psyche, leaving me frantic to find a conception and a context that would set the bone and bind the wound. Then on the third day, when my despairing confusion had reached its nadir, I came upon a quote from the Indian philosopher Sankara that acted as the proverbial solid particle dropped into the saturated solution of my soul. Sankara wrote, "With half a stanza, I will declare what has been said in thousands of volumes. Brahman is real. The world is false. The soul is only Brahman, nothing else." I had long been acquainted with the Hindu idea that the material world is actually Maya, illusion, a kind of mirage resting upon the absolute reality which the Vedantic Hindus called Brahman. The Hindu sages generally taught that moksha, the experience of release from this illusion and the subsequent realization of ultimate reality, constitutes life's supreme happiness and final fulfillment. But Marco, by contextualizing Sankara's classic one-line summation of Vedanta inside a potent exploration of Western pessimism, seemed to be positing that the uniform substratum of being that underlines physical existence is an utter nightmare. And if the soul is only Brahman, meaning that the individual human self is at root nothing but a particularized manifestation of this pervasive primary reality, I couldn't bear to follow the perversion of the Eastern beatific vision to its conclusion. Its repercussions were simply too awful to articulate. Of the scientific line of thought interwoven with philosophy, all I could comprehend was that Marco was struggling with some unresolved issue in quantum physics. The mathematical work was beyond me, but from his text notes I could gather enough to grasp the bare essence of the matter, which had something to do with the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. I read that the equations used in this science are straightforward and uncontested in terms of their practical applications, as attested by everything from television to the hydrogen bomb, but that no satisfactory explanation for their meaning, their overall implications at the macroscopic level of existence, had yet been established. On the subatomic level, I read particles flash into and out of existence for no discernible reason, and the behavior of any single particle is apparently arbitrary and usually unpredictable. If there is a cause or purpose behind this behavior, then it is one that the human mind is, to all appearances, structurally prevented from comprehending. In other words, for all we know, the fundamental ruling principles at the most basic level of physical reality may well be what our minds and languages must necessarily label chaos and madness. This predicament of knowledge, so I learned from Marco's commentary, had remained essentially unchanged for 80 years. And Marco possessed the audacity to believe that he had begun to solve the riddle that had haunted the keenest scientific minds for nearly a century. But he expressed his solution in a series of mathematical equations which were incomprehensible to me, and which may as well have been hieroglyphs carved on the inner wall of an Egyptian tomb. My experience of these blossoming revelations was appalling. It was also progressively intense. The further I advanced in the notebook, the more powerful became the rising tide of revulsion inside me. At times it grew so overwhelming that I was forced to stop for several hours. On one occasion, after I had rushed to the bathroom in the grip of an actual physical sickness, I laid aside the notebook for more than a day. Late in the week, I realized that what I was experiencing could only be described as horror. a word whose referent I had never really known. Marco's comments about the human need for illusion began to make progressively more sense. For if the ideas in his notebook really did point to reality, then I would rather be deluded. If it was strength to gaze unflinchingly into that abyss, then I would rather be weak. It was with a veritably religious sense of fear and trembling that I turned on the last day of the week to the 45th page of the notebook. Slowly, I read through the first of the two quotes that appeared alone on the page, the one from a book whose title sounded distinctly Hindu, even though I had never before encountered it and subsequently forgot it. As its significance became clear to me, I felt the words begin to sink into my mind like vicious hooks. Foolish soul, wilt thou comprehend the all, the great central mystery? Man's place is the middle. Thou approachest the gate in both the greatest and the least, in the face of the night sky at the core of a dust mote, the same one. Wretched is he who hears the call, but more wretched still the one who answers it. The final quotation was from a story by H.P. Lovecraft, and in the margin beside it Marco had written, "The capstone. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." 5. The words on that page signaled the end of my journey through the dark corridors of Marco's obsession. Rather than trying to see what lay past page 46 and risking another encounter with that awful picture, I closed the notebook and shoved it far back into a drawer, wishing fiercely that it could be equally easy to bury the memory of it. But try as I might, I could not stop my thoughts from returning to it and gnawing on it like a trapped animal might gnaw off its own leg. That was exactly the way I felt, as if I had become ensnared in some vile trap and grown so desperate to escape that I might willingly do violence to myself. But no matter how many times I examined and re-examined and struggled violently against the notebook's all-encompassing message of horror and despair, I could find no way to extricate myself from it. No loose spring or faulty trigger in its mechanism that might allow me to slip free. Its internal coherence and emotional power, as well as its universal scope, made it the perfect prison for mind and spirit. My whole life was overturned in shockingly rapid fashion by this festering spiritual disease. For example, my teaching and class schedules that semester were mercifully light, but even the slight strain of conducting a freshman philosophy class proved almost more than I could handle. How could I speak of epistemology and metaphysics when I had recently beheld the fanged and fleshy vortex that lies waiting to devour all knowledge? How could I teach about Socrates when I had discovered that to examine one's life is to invite a nightmarish destruction, or about Descartes, when I had been shown that the thinking mind is a mere wisp of smoke blowing over a fetid ocean of entity? More than one student gave me a sidelong look as my lectures were derailed by the uncontrollable quaver that had crept into my voice. I had always basked in the knowledge of the positive impression I made on others, but now I could tell from people's reactions that my personal manner had taken a turn for the bizarre and disturbing, and yet I was helpless to rein this in. I felt a trembling all the way to my core and found myself frequently gripped by the irrational notion that people's altered reactions to me were caused by my new inner eye, which bathed everyone and everything in a beam of cold black light. This dark emanation, as I fancied it, even though I knew the idea was insane, was perceived by others as a certain indefinable aura of disturbance and dread in my personal presence. I knew I could not go on like this, and several courses of action suggested themselves. The most obvious was to seek psychological help. A less obvious, but no less compelling possibility was to seek spiritual counseling. Medical help from a neurologist was not out of the question, or was self-medication via any number of consciousness-clouding substances. My fundamental problem seemed to be an excess of metaphysical sight. Anything that promised to blind or even temporarily blur that deadly gaze was an attractive prospect. How, then, I ended up taking the course of action I took is still a mystery. Rather than turning to the most obvious sources of solace, I returned to the man who had done this violence to me. When all options had been considered, I could think of nothing but talking with Marco again. I had to know more about his notebook, about the impetus that had driven him to record it, and the power that had led him to create that drawing. I felt that if I could not hear some answers to these and 1,000 other questions, I might literally go mad with rage and confusion. So I made up my mind to see him, and that was when it dawned on me that I had neither seen nor heard from him for 10 days, not since our last conversation in his dorm room. Under normal circumstances, I would have wondered why he had been so conspicuously absent, since we usually ran into each other on campus almost every day. But I had been preoccupied with his notebook and my growing distress, and now that I needed him, he was missing in action. I silently cursed his ostentatious boycott of cell phones and email, which he regularly railed on as destroyers of personal solitude and public discourse. In the past, I had never really felt their lack, since Marco and I had encountered each other in person as we went about our campus business, but now I found I had no way of getting in contact with him, short of visiting his dorm again, which I hated to do with the memory of my awful experience there still paining me like an open wound. But I also had no choice. And so on the 11th day after this nightmare had begun, I returned to the site of its inception. My stomach turned cold as I rode the elevator up to Marco's floor. By the time I approached his featureless brown door, my hands were trembling. Predictably. Why I should have found it predictable, I don't know, but it seemed entirely appropriate in a poetic sort of way. He did not answer when I knocked. I stood there in the hallway for a long moment, staring alternately down at the faded gray carpet and then back up at the door as I debated whether to try the knob. Each time I reached for it, a thrill of panic surged through me. Finally, in a kind of daze at the depth of my own wretchedness, I gave up and admitted that I could not do it. The situation was just too symmetrical, albeit in reverse fashion, to the door scenario in my recent dream. But I still had to find him. So next I went and inquired of his professors. They told me he hadn't attended classes since Monday of the previous week, the last day I had seen him. One of them, Dr. Albert Kreeft of the physics department, told me, "Be sure to tell him the entire scientific community is waiting with bated breath for his theory of everything." The mockery in the white-haired man's thickly accented voice was blatant, and when I asked him what he meant, he said, "Ask him sometime to show you his preliminary work suggesting a new unified field theory. The finished thesis ought to make for an interesting novel." The physics department lay outside of my usual academic orbit, and I was unfamiliar with this thoroughly unpleasant little man. When I asked him about his relationship to Marco, he said with a sour edge, "I'm his thesis advisor," and turned back to his computer screen, refusing even to acknowledge me anymore. And that was that. I walked out of the physics building realizing that I had already exhausted my useful options. The extent of my ignorance of Marco hit home as I recognized that the only thing left to do was visit the places where we normally crossed paths, the library, the quad, the student commons, and hope that I would see him. So I went to those places, even though I hated to be around crowds in my current condition. And of course, he was nowhere to be found. I ended up in the second floor of the library at the same study kiosk where I'd run into him while seeking a copy of Plotinus. Standing there beneath that tall window in that silent hall filled with row upon row of stately books, I tried to conjure a spark of my former aesthetic bliss. My unconscious mind responded by throwing up an image of chittering teeth and a mood of stark, staring barrenness. Maybe my next move was inspired by the fact that I had come full circle to the starting point of my present unhappy state. From the library, I set out for Marco's dorm room again. Last time I had been following the flesh and blood man himself. This time I was following the thought of him. Once again, when I reached his room and knocked on the door, there was no answer. Before the memory of my dream could throw me again into that panicked paralysis, I seized the knob and wrenched it violently. Much to my surprise, it turned easily and the door swung open on silent hinges. I stepped gingerly inside and found a room where Marco was absent and nothing at all was out of order. His bed was made, his bookshelves were full, and upon opening his closet I found a rack full of clothes. I had half expected to find evidence of some sort of disturbance. Clothes flung everywhere, a shattered window, who knows what. The other half of me had expected to be overwhelmed by a nameless horror. So the sight of his empty, tidy, unmolested room threw me into a fit of unfulfilled foreboding. Everything was as silent and still as a cemetery, and in that stillness an approaching culmination trembled in the air. I sat down on his bed with a hot lump in my throat and realized with something like humor that I was about to break down and weep. Nothing made sense. Everything was wrecked and hopeless. How had I come to this in such a short time? Less than 2 weeks earlier, I had been leading a fairly contented life, with a bright future in academia. I had taken pleasure in my work and my modest social life, including the occasional romance. I had possessed a shining intellectual and emotional intensity that brought praise from my professors, and yet all of that had been overturned and undermined in a shockingly short order. When I tried now to consider my future, I saw nothing but an endless black tunnel lined with teeth, painful and meaningful experiences. The future was a dark, empty road winding through a blasted landscape toward the shell of a dead city. The journey was a nightmare and the destination a hell. My former goals and pleasures littered my psyche like the dry corpses of dead loved ones, and I wanted nothing more than to sink into oblivion. Whether sleep or death did not matter. Was all of this really true? Was my life, was existence itself truly what I now perceived it to be, nothing more than a short interlude in an otherwise unbroken continuum of horror, a sometimes distracting but ultimately vain dream that was destined to end with the terrible awakening to the abiding reality of chaos, of madness, of nightmare, of teeth? The floor lurched beneath my feet, and with a silent hiss like the seething of stars, that gaping hole in reality opened up again, not on any page this time, but within me. My nostrils were clotted with the stench of rotting, half-digested worlds, and I felt the eternal agony of infinite rows of needle teeth sinking into my soul. That should have been the end. I should have known nothing else for all eternity, but then impossibly it was over. The room blinked back into view. The floor rushed back into place, and I was sitting on a plain institutional bed in an ordinary dorm room on a bright spring day. The horror had claimed me and then spat me out. I was still reeling in a daze as I stood and exited Marco's room. I could hardly walk, but a sudden impulse had taken hold of me. I wanted to finish reading Marco's notebook. I was, in fact, desperate to do so. Caution be damned. I was going to learn what he had written beyond the page with the picture. I was going to find out everything there was to know about the thought process, emotional pattern, and dark epiphany that had flowed out of and led up to this catastrophe that had engulfed not only me, but, as I strongly suspected, him as well. Riding the elevator down to the ground floor, I experienced repeated waves of joy at finding that I could still feel a sense of purpose. 6. The walk back to my house was a preview of hell itself. Although the afternoon sun hung bright and warm in a brilliant sky and college students lounged everywhere in the refreshing air, chatting at tables and lolling on fresh green patches of landscaped lawn, I saw it all as if through a dark-tinted pane of glass. The light appeared shaded and muted like night scenes in a movie that were obviously shot in broad daylight with a filter on the lens. I kept noticing movements in the periphery of my vision wherever shadows and dark spots lay. Beneath a bench, at the foot of a hickory tree, under the granite lip of a merrily splashing fountain, in each shadow I saw what looked like living forms crouched and waiting, but when I looked directly at them, they disappeared. It gradually became apparent to me that I was seeing shadows more clearly than the objects that cast them, and that my inner eye was revealing a lurking presence in them that I had never suspected. Traumatized and terrified, I finally arrived at my lonely house north of campus and collapsed on the couch. After listening to my own shaking breath for a few moments, I dragged myself to my feet and went to fetch the notebook. It remained where I had left it, at the back of my desk drawer, and I felt vaguely surprised, since I had half expected the thing to have disappeared like its author. Its dull red cover seemed to mock me, as if its very muteness represented its defiance of my understanding. I sat at the desk and flipped through to page 47, feeling not nearly as foolish as I had expected when I actually squeezed my eyes shut as I turned past the mandala. I opened them to see that, sure enough, there was more writing in the notebook's latter pages. Text that normally would have filled only half a page in Marco's virtually microscopic hand now sprawled across 3 pages. Reading it, I began to shiver even more violently as I understood the cause of this atypical sloppiness. Marco had scribbled these notes immediately after his own first experience with the mandala, which, as it turned out, he had not drawn of his own free will. His notes insinuated far more than they stated and glanced upon several unfamiliar items, but I recognized their guiding emotion of horrified hysteria all too well. Ironically, they also underscored yet again how greatly his awesome intellect and fearsome self-control exceeded mine, since it was a marvel that he was able to marshal any coherent thought and write any words at all in such a state. This is what he wrote. Almost sucked in, it almost pushed completely through. God, how? The perfect sequence of shapes, the perfect placement and size on the infinite continuum of distance between points. The precise purpose in guiding my hand. Would it open the gate for anyone? Render all preparation unnecessary? Chance, purpose, meaning, what damned idiocy! Our insane desire for truth when illusion is the need. Fantasy, dreams, divine delusions. What price? The true vision. What must we become? Lovecraft correct not only about our frightful position in the universe, but about the vast conceit of those who babble of the malignant ancient ones, not hostile to consciousness, indifferent to it. Consciousness is a disease. If only you knew, Miguel. Final horror reserved for mind, not body. Azathoth, not conscious, pure being. Consciousness, intelligence, mind, the ultimate tragedy. To be somehow self-aware, yet wholly incidental to the purpose of the universe. Chaos and psychosis in human terms. Ultimate irony of the human predicament. Perfection of specifically human quality results in self-negation. Conscious only to become aware of the utter horror of consciousness. The ideas encoded in these words flamed inside me as I read and reread them. Much of what he had written was obscure, but I understood enough. Somehow, Marco had been offered a glimpse into the chaos at the center of being. For reasons known only to itself, some power had chosen him as a conduit for the revelation of our frightful position in the universe. And then Marco, for reasons known only to himself, had shared his affliction with me. Of course, this only intensified my need to find him, since I now feared that he had suffered some cosmically awful fate, and that if I continued on my current course, I would join him in it. In my anguish, I unthinkingly reached down and turned one more page of the notebook, and what I saw on the following page initiated the final phase of my descent into horror. I froze and read the item 3 times while its significance sank in. Then I sprang from the chair and lurched for the door, where I fumbled with the knob for a miniature eternity before finally turning it. Then I was outside and racing across campus, not caring that my front door was still banging open and the notebook was still lying upon the living room floor where I had dropped it. What I had seen was a brief notice that Marco had clipped from the Terrence Sun-Gazette, the local newspaper, and had pasted carefully onto the page following his feverish final notes. It stared up at my empty living room as I ran to avert an inconceivable catastrophe, its words saying far more than the journalist who wrote them had intended. World-renowned scientist to lecture at Terrence University, British physicist and astronomer Nigel Williamson will deliver a lecture entitled Chance, Meaning, and the Hidden Variable in the Quantum Universe at the Terrence University campus. Williamson, a Cambridge professor who is visiting Terrence as the first stop on a worldwide lecture tour, is known for his tendency to ruffle the feathers of his colleagues with his unorthodox theories. His claim to have arrived at an explanation for, quote, the seemingly causeless actions of subatomic particles, unquote, has aroused worldwide interest and a great deal of skepticism in the scientific community. He is scheduled to speak on Thursday, May 2nd at 7 p.m. in the lecture hall of the Stockwell Science Building on the Terrence University campus. The lecture is free and open to the public. 7. I reached the Stockwell Science Building in a matter of minutes. The run of barely a single mile had exhausted my soft scholar's body, and I fell gasping and heaving against the double-door entrance. Peering inside, I saw a digital clock on the far wall of the foyer that read 7:24. This encouraged me a little. The lecture would have already started by now, and there was no obvious commotion going on, so perhaps my awful hunch had been mistaken. Still gasping, I glanced up for a moment at the twilight sky and saw a yellowish half-moon shining through the branches of a scraggly tree. The once familiar desk was now the dead, decaying, fetal carcass of some unimaginably monstrous creature. And while I watched in awe with my dark inner light burning like a beacon, the creature began to stir and wake. Dread washed back over me like an icy wave, and I flung myself through the door of the science building as much to escape the awakening gaze of the moon as to stop the tragedy I feared might be occurring within. I burst into the lecture hall to find a small group of middle-aged men and women checking their watches, tapping their feet, and exchanging glances, filled with annoyance and unease. No lecture was in progress, and I gathered that I had entered as the impatience of the tiny crowd had reached a snapping point. Most were seated, but a few had gathered around a lectern down front, where a small, nervous, balding man was blinking through thick-lensed eyeglasses and trying to placate them. Several people looked up when I entered, and I saw their faces tightened into angry, worried lines at the sight of me. Ignoring them as best I could, I made my way to the bespectacled man. He stammered and finally stopped in his nervous explanations when I approached, and the cluster of people turned to stare at me. I asked, "Where is Professor Williamson?" And my voice emerged as a harsh demand. It also seemed to reach me from a distance, and I noticed that I didn't feel a part of the situation at all, but rather like a spectator watching a theatrical presentation in which I and the others were performing. The jittery little man played his part admirably. "I was just explaining," he began, and then tripped over his own jitteriness. His role was obviously that of the flustered, mousy man, whereas mine was at least partly that of the one who flusters. He finally gave up and gestured miserably toward a door behind him that appeared to lead into a conference room. "He's in there. Is he alone?" Mousy Man was growing more unhappy with each passing second. "Well, no, there's somebody in there with him. Like I've been telling these people, a very agitated young man showed up a few minutes before 7 and demanded to see the professor. I told him we were busy, but then Nigel came out and chatted with him for a minute and seemed quite interested in what the young man had to say. Fascinated, actually. They went into the conference room half an hour ago and haven't come out." "Have you not?" By this point, I was all but yelling, and the other performers' eyes were widening as they suddenly drew away and left me alone to dominate the stage and my unfortunate foil. "Well, no," he said, and began shifting from foot to foot. "I didn't feel comfortable interrupting them, and the young man, he was quite, passionate. His eyes were wild, like—" He cut himself short and looked to someone, anyone, for help, but I could read the unspoken words in his anxious and forlorn expression. "Like your eyes." I opened my mouth to speak another line, but a sudden loud thump from the conference room silenced us all. It sounded like a heavy chair or table falling over. Then a wild, incoherent shouting that froze my blood. For even through the thick open door and the hysterical tone, I recognized the voice and accent of my friend Marco. I bolted past the stunned group of spectators and grabbed the door handle, only to find it locked. Now another voice, panicked and British and sharp with terror, answered Marco's, and the rest of the scene played out off stage, behind the locked door.
"What are you doing?" "You must not. Those who know it fully would perish. The gate is in the great and the small. You cannot let the madness become sanity."
"Stop it! What are you doing? Roger? Open the door, Roger!
No! Stop! The gates above and below. The one in the middle. Oh, God, the teeth! The teeth!"
The play was over, the spectator feeling dissolved, and I stepped off the stage into reality. Everything was completely, horribly present and actual. A woman in the crowd was weeping. A man had run halfway up the stairs toward the rear exit and then stopped, and now stood there blinking in befuddlement as if he had lost his way. The rest of the group stood and sat in various states of paralyzed shock. Then the spell broke all at once and panic set in. Some sprang for the exits while others rushed toward me. Everyone screamed and shouted something different to do until finally someone ran out to the hallway, blundered into an unlocked maintenance closet, and returned with an enormous claw hammer. I snatched it from him and set to work on the door handle while somebody else phoned the police. The handle separated and crashed to the carpet after 6 stout blows. Clutching the hammer like a talisman, I pushed the door open and took a faltering step forward while the others clustered behind me in a sudden, awed silence. The room I had entered was a standard conference room, stocked with a long, narrow table and 8 plastic chairs. One of these was sprawled on its back amidst the wreckage of an overturned barrister's bookcase, whose windows had exploded on impact with the edge of the table and then the face of the floor. The resulting spray of glass was soaked with what looked like gallons of blood. The net effect was a floor carpeted with crimson diamonds and jagged bloody eggshells. My eyes followed a distinctly differentiated blood trail through the carnage, tracing it to the point where it disappeared behind the table. As if caught in a nightmare, I crunched unhesitatingly across the crimson carpet to gaze upon what it was that I had gone there to prevent. Nigel Williamson, physicist, astronomer, Cambridge professor, brilliant iconoclast, would never have the chance to reveal to the world his grand theory concerning the inner purpose of the universe as embodied in the chaotic irrationalities of the quantum realm. His intellectual brilliance had not been enough to save him, for now he lay on his back behind the table where Marco had dragged him. The 9-inch piece of glass Marco had used to eviscerate him still protruding from his side. His frozen expression of horror must have matched the one that slowly began to twist in my own face, but if so, I was unaware of it. My eyes, my mind, my awareness, my very being were all filled to bursting by a sight that blazed with a too real intensity and became an instant symbol of everything I had realized and endured. The blood-spattered, empty-eyed face of my friend Marco as he crouched over the professor's body and mechanically devoured his innards. 8. That gruesome image, with its oversaturated quality of ontological vividness, remained with me forever, even after the passing of years had begun to blunt some of the other memories. Some of the first of those to go were the ones concerning the immediate aftermath of that final event. I remember there was quite a furor on campus and in the town and even in the national news media. I know I was asked many questions by people acting in official capacities, but the specifics of it all, just like the specifics of the actions that I and the others took right after we found Marco in there with the professor, have been swallowed up by the image of that bloody face with its blank eyes and mechanical masticating motion. What I do remember with clarity are my broad reactions to the uproar, since they changed the course of my life and brought me to my present circumstance. At the height of it all, when I feared I might literally go insane from everything, I quit my beloved studies and relocated to another town where nobody knew me and I could live in relative anonymity. I still live there today and hold down the most trivial job I could find that will still provide me with enough income to afford a shoddy apartment where I hide from the world and hope for a merciful end to my existence. In general, I apply myself diligently to ignoring and forgetting the world outside the bubble of boredom that I have created, but from time to time I buy a newspaper or switch on my little television to see if the direction of world events might have changed a little, and of course it is not, nor will it ever. For everything is still disintegrating inexorably into madness, and I, unlike most people, know precisely why. Before Marco dragged me into his living nightmare, I was worried, like everyone else, about the mass cultural insanity that had gripped the 20th and early 21st centuries. Like everyone else, I noticed that things seemed to be roaring toward an apocalyptic climax. And I had my pet theories to explain it all, but now I see how absurd they all were. Because what is happening is in fact a profound and far-reaching reordering of reality itself, societal, cultural, personal, and even physical. In essence, the prophecies of Lovecraft and Nietzsche are coming true right before our eyes, with effects that are not only personal and cultural, but ontological. Our excess of vast scientific knowledge and technological prowess has proceeded in lockstep with a collective descent into species-level insanity. You only have to watch 2 minutes of television, glance at a headline, or eavesdrop on a random conversation to learn of it. Ignorance and idiocy, riots and revolutions. These and 1,000 other signposts like them are only the most pointed and obvious manifestations of the all-pervasive malaise that has come to define us. And since, as Sankara observed, we are nothing but particularized manifestations of the ground of being itself, we are not only witnesses to this breakdown, but participants in it, enablers of the transformation of the world into a veil of horror through the metaphysical potency of our very witnessing. God looks out through each of our eyes, an abyss of insatiable hunger and infinite teeth, and the dark light of his consciousness makes each of us a lamp that illuminates a new and terrible truth. I find it ironic that the man who cursed me with this vision of the world will not even be aware of it when everything comes to fruition. Marco spends his days and nights screaming out his madness in a prison for the criminally insane. I visited him only once when the police were still trying to discover where he had hidden himself during his 10-day absence, a question they never answered, nor did I. I almost could bear to look at him, and when I finally did meet his gaze, I knew at once that my friend was dead. His eyes had gone permanently dark in the manner I had briefly glimpsed so long ago in his dorm room, and I recognized his condition as an advanced case of the same state that would sooner or later manifest in every person on the planet. Something had compelled me to bring the notebook, which I had retrieved from my living room floor, and then carefully preserved for no reason I could articulate. When I showed it to Marco, he sprang at me without warning and knocked me to the floor, snarling and shrieking in a feral frenzy. The savagery of his attack stunned me, and before I could recover, he had seized the notebook with his teeth and shaken it to shreds like a dog with a rat. Then he turned on me again, and it was only the intervention of the hospital staff that saved me from having my throat torn out. His doctors said it would be best if I stayed away after that. Later, I heard that he managed to break his restraints after I left, and that in the absence of another object, he turned on himself. Before the orderlies could reach him, he chewed off and swallowed 2 of his own fingers. What scares me the most is knowing that the transcendent insanity gnawing at the shell of Marco is the same insanity that waits to welcome me in death. All too well do I understand the wisdom of the ancient Greeks, which held that the best thing is never to have been born. To exist at all is to know the horror of no escape. Nietzsche said the thought of suicide can comfort a man through many a dark night, but it is no comfort to someone like me, who knows all too well what awaits. There is only one hope for my salvation. Over the years, I have become an assiduous student of Lovecraft, not just his stories, but his essays and letters, and I have marveled at the man's uncanny ability to see so deeply into the truth and yet remain so composed and kind-hearted. Perhaps this gentle New Englander knew something that I do not, something he tried to convey when he wrote of the vast conceit of those who babbled of the malignant ancient ones. Perhaps the horror exists only in me, not in reality. Perhaps Marco was wrong, and there is no need to fear the truth. After all, it knows only itself, and maybe I will not perceive it as horrific after I die. Perhaps I will be so thoroughly consumed by and identified with it that I will not even exist at all, and any sense of horror will prove to be as fleeting and finite as the self that sensed it. If this is true, then may it come quickly. But this hope, however appealing, can never sustain me for long, for it is clear that I am already identified with that horrible truth, and yet I still find it a horror. The clear evidence of this identification manifests in my own body, in the fundamental physical drive that compels me to take nourishment, and the anatomical structures that have been evolved to accomplish this purpose: lips and tongue, teeth and gums, throat and stomach. Life, as Joseph Campbell once observed, is a horrific thing that sustains itself by feeding on other life. I have gained a new and awful awareness of this fact in the form of a certain nagging sensitivity in my mouth. All day and night I am plagued by an unpleasant awareness of those protruding bits of bone whose function is to grind plant and animal flesh to pulp in order to sustain this bodily life. Sometimes, when this awareness has tortured me for hours on end, I will go to the mirror and draw back my lips to gaze at the truth. This mockery of the facial expression that conventionally expresses pleasure reminds me a bit of the bliss I once hoped to find in philosophies of ultimate beauty. But even that is gone now, swallowed down the bottomless throat of the cosmic mystery that forever feeds on all things. Do I seem mad? Do I sound like a man who has become lost in his own private delusion of hell? Then let me remind you that you too exhibit the same stigmata in your own body. Show me your smile, and I will show you your fate.